Give me a thumbs up if you can hear me. All right, great. Drinking and driving isn't a punishable offense unless your BAC is over 0.08. Gambling isn't illegal if it goes to charitable causes. Simply put, the government is adept at punishing only certain scenarios of questionable actions. Because I believe these are explicit dangerous situations when someone is texting while walking, I affirm resolve, texting while walking in public should be fined. Merriam-Webster defines should as used to indicate obligation. One of the U.S. government's obligation is to protect its people. Thus, if I'm able to convince the audience that this punishment helps to protect Americans, you ought to vote pro. I advocate that the time when this punishment needs to be done is when one crosses a street in public. They should then be fined. New Jersey Assemblywoman Pamela Lampitt explains, distracted pedestrians like distracted drivers present a danger to themselves and drivers on the road. An individual crossing the road distracted by their smartphone presents just as much risk to motorists as someone jaywalking and should be held at minimum to the same penalty. Under a new ban in Honolulu signed into law last week, anyone crossing a street or highway while viewing a mobile electronic device will face a fine of $15 to $35 for the first offense, which then scales up for their second and third offenses. This was then followed by Stanford, Connecticut, who also identified the risk with crossing the street distracted and also issues a fine for people texting. The reason why these states have signed in legislation is backed by numbers. A National Safety Council report showed that distracted walking incidents involving cell phones accounted for an estimated 11,101 injuries from 2000 to 2011. And a study from National Governors Highway Safety Association found that the number of emergency room visits from distracted walking injuries doubled between 2005 and 2010 to more than 1,500. Experts believe it's because of increased smartphone usage, and it could be even higher because some people are embarrassed to go to the emergency room after texting while walking. Furthermore, in an Australian study, scientists identified the effect of phone use while walking. They found bodies' movements were evaluated using a 3D movement analysis system, and researchers found that texting affected movements the most while walking. When participating while texting, they walked more slowly, deviated more from a straight line, and moved their neck less while they're reading on their phone. It's funny that the symptoms while walking and texting sound exactly like being drunk. And in 22 states, it's a punishable offense to be publicly intoxicated. Why? In order to protect the safety of the persons themselves and the people around them. If walking while texting not only puts you at risk, but creates hazard for drivers, it's clear action must be taken. As a 17-year-old, I of all people see the amount of texting my peers engage in. When you do it at work, it's fine. In school, fine. When you're at home, even if you're walking in school, or the street, it poses a risk to you and the drivers around you. So for those 30 seconds, I say put it away. Thus, I affirm.
Texting while walking in public should not be fined for 3 reasons. It won't fix the harm, it'll cause numerous new harms, and there are better means to address the pedestrian accidents. It won't fix the harms for 2 reasons. A, similar laws have been shown to be ineffective in the past. From 2014, the Association of the Advancement of Automotive Medicine, 2009 National Telephone Survey of Drivers found no significant association texting and state texting bans while driving. In California, Louisiana, and Minnesota, there were significant modest increases in collision claim rates after the bans took effect relative to the control states. Similar and significant increases were also found in drivers younger than 25 in these 3 states, and in Washington there was essentially no change in the claim rates. B, it fails to account for most accidents. This is from 2017 safety.com. Their statistics, Ohio State University, showed that talking on the phone made up 69% of such injuries, while texting only accounted for 9%. Talking, checking email, using social networking apps, and even playing games all contribute to the problem of distracted pedestrians far more than texting does. Number 2, causes 5 significant harms. A, the police and courts are now chasing people who are texting on their phone instead of performing. B, criminalizing a common activity, creating a police state in which areas that abridge basic freedoms in public areas. C, it leads to more confrontation and police encounters, thus exacerbating opportunities for police violence, which we've seen a lot of lately. D, similar laws such as jaywalking laws and vehicle stop laws have an unjust racial bias against minorities. 2014, Washington Post. Black drivers are 31% more likely to be pulled over than whites. They are more likely to be subject to police searches as white drivers, and they're nearly twice as likely to be given not to be given any reason for the traffic stop. 2017, Sacramento B. The Sacramento police issued 233 tickets for jaywalking last year in the police department that includes North Sacramento and Del Paso Heights. Black people received 111 of those citations, nearly 50%, but amounted for only 15% of the area's residents. E. The fines disproportionately hurt the poor citizens. 2017 Current Affairs. Wide swaths of low-income community resources are being stripped away due to their inability to overcome the daunting financial burdens placed on them by the state and local governments. There are countless stories of people being threatened with jail time for failing to pay fines for offenses like unmowed lawns and cracked driveways. We don't need more of that in our society. Number 3, there's a better solution. Even if you were to accept pros harms that are greater than the harms that I present, and even if you were to find that banning texting would help, these are big ifs, there's a much better proposed resolution. The resolution impacts and that was fine all forms of distracted walking in areas where motor vehicles are operating. It affects more dangerous activities in a more restricted.
All right, so I'm just going to go straight down the flow. First, we have our first contention, fixing harms. Subpoint A, 2014, drivers didn't get affected. What I would say is that this evidence clearly links to driving regulations. So specifically the evidence texting while driving, and then we issued regulation on it, and we didn't affect the drivers who were texting. I would say, A, those people are making a choice to violate the law, and the fines didn't hurt them because it's obviously difficult for police to enforce this. I would say it's far easier to enforce this because it's not on drivers, it's on pedestrians. And pedestrians walking are clearly identified with their phone out. It's not as hard as a police officer trying to identify someone who's texting. So even if we didn't see a reduction in the amount in one specific city or state, I couldn't remember, it still doesn't matter because we're identifying people crossing the street. And I would say in the 3 largest cities, New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles, since we've had jaywalking laws, we've seen a significant reduction in the amount of jaywalking incidents that occur because I would say it's effective for police officers to be able to stop these people. Then we go to the next piece of evidence, which is Ohio State, saying that texting only takes up 9% of accidents. I would rebuttal this by saying that David Struble, a director of UAB's Youth Safety Laboratory, put 125 participants to the test and were asked to cross a 2-lane road while cars drove along at 30 miles an hour. He published the results online and found that people talking on the phone were twice as likely to be hit than those with 0 distractions, 12% compared to 6%. But even more alarming, people who were texting were twice as likely to be hit as those talking, 25%. So even if the number of accidents occurring are less than the number of people talking on the phone, I would say the number of people talking on the phone is far more, but the concentration of people texting is the most dangerous because you saw 25% of those people be involved in a possible collision. Then we'll go to the second argument, which is the 5 harms. The first overarching one main response is that police are racist. I'm not going to try to defend that. All I'm saying is that this policy would be effective because a fine is far more effective than a punishment. And also we can't say that police will stop people, but I'll move on to that as I go through. One, you say it abridges rights. I would say it doesn't abridge any right because there's no right to cross a street while texting on your phone. There's no right to be publicly intoxicated, and that's why there's a punishment for it, because it puts the people on the street at risk and it puts you at risk. You can drink at home just like you can text at home. But when you're crossing a street, I'm not abridging your right. I'm just telling you that if it keeps drivers more safe, then there's no reason to do it. Then one of the other points was that there's a lot of police violence. I would say it's ridiculous that a fine for texting would result in more police violence or targeting. But even if you're going to use Terry stopping, which is there's Terry stops for African Americans, I would say that's far different because those usually involve drugs or alcohol and a driver. I would say this is just random searching on the street, but it's not really random searching because it's clearly defined when you're texting.
Well, let me respond to your rebuttals first. You say that my evidence is about driving only, but it's a very analogous situation. Let me read you some extension reasons on why the laws are ineffective. This is from Mother Jones, 2013. Single occupancy vehicle crashes dip noticeably when a state legislator first enacts texting and driving ban. But the change is always short-lived, according to the study, which examined data from every state of Alaska from 2017 through 2010. Within months, the accident rate typically returns to pre-ban levels. The researchers attribute this pattern to the announcement effect, when the drivers are for the perceived law enforcement threat, only to return to their old habits when law enforcement appears to be ineffective. There are millions of people who use their phones texting and walking and talking every day. The chances that you are going to be able to effectively enforce this law on the total of the population with the very limited police force that we have is pretty much zero. And when people realize that, they're going to completely ignore this legislation like they have done in the past. The driving case is very analogous because it has to do with human behavior, not with the specifics of the situation of the law. You have no extensive evidence that these texting bans actually work. It is only presumed that they will stop people from doing these activities, but you've presented no evidence that they will. And while I've presented evidence of an analogous situation that shows that they would not. Next up, texting is the most dangerous of these activities. And in your case, you also mentioned evidence that people walk funny when they're testing. I read that same piece of evidence. The reason that they walk funny is because they're walking in a way that is more cautious. They lift their feet higher, run into things because they know they're in a heightened sense of danger. So walking funny is not dangerous in and of itself. But you say that texting is more dangerous. However, many more people are. The vast majority of actual accidents happen from that cause. Therefore, that is the cause that we should be addressing, along with texting, if you really believe in these harms versus the harms that I'm presenting. So, therefore, not the resolution. You say that you don't contend that it would be a waste of law enforcement. However, you do say that we don't have a right to cross the street. Pretty sure we have a right to walk where we want to walk, so long as we're within the bounds of the law. We also have a right to use our phones when we want to. Now, perhaps we should be cautious, but we don't need the police telling us all day, everywhere we walk around, how to be cautious. It would be a, a fine for texting equals violence. Yeah, well, no, it's not the fine itself. The thing is once police have these powers, they can stop anybody on the street who has their phone out for any reason whatsoever, interrogate them, search for drugs, do any kind of other encounter they want. And this can lead to all kinds of violence. People fear the police these days because of the problems that we have been having. I don't dispute the harms of texting while walking, the potential harms. However, there are much greater harms that we should solve for. And there are many problems that come from creating a police state for this simple action.
All right, so first let's talk about the announcement effect. That's really problematic because essentially the underlying argument of the announcement effect is any form of legislation that doesn't work should just be stopped. Under your world, you would say, well, we have these regulations against texting while driving, and they don't work after the announcement. So I guess the only other solution to that is let's not have these announcements or legislation against texting while driving. I would say that even if they don't work in some cities, on the whole, regulation against texting while driving is something that we continue to need to do, even if it doesn't have absolute results. Because that's like saying, well, drinking while driving regulation doesn't work, let's stop it. I think that's really problematic. So even if I can't prove that this is going to be feasible in the future, I still say if there's a problem, we need to take action, and that's how the government works. This goes into the next argument about feasibility. That's not my responsibility. If this wasn't possible, there's no point in having this debate. My job is to convince the audience that texting while walking in public should be fine, and it's the government's obligation to do so. Whether or not it's feasible is up to the government. But I can't show you that it would be feasible because, quite frankly, it hasn't been implemented yet. Which then goes to the idea that on the feasibility argument, if it wasn't feasible, no state would take the time to use legislation hours to enact laws. But yet Honolulu did it 2 weeks ago, and Stamford, Connecticut did it a week after. I can't tell you the results of what happened in 2 weeks. Tell you that the only reason these governments are doing it is because they see a need for it and thus they prove feasibility. But then you would say, then let's go on to this thing that while you're texting, you're more cautious. I would say even if you're more cautious, the number that I presented from Dr. Schwubel is that 25% of those people crossing the street while texting are involved in collisions. Even if they account for less than the people walking, you still see a higher concentration of people texting while walking and then being hit. And a higher concentration is what's more important, not overall amount of accidents. But even if you find that calling and walking is problematic, that's still an affirmative ballot because you can still vote to find people who are texting while walking and also find people who are calling while walking, all giving me a pro ballot. Then we go into this idea that you have the right to cross the street. I never said anything's wrong with that. I just said there's certain situations, which started with the beginning of my case, that are regulated by the government. Right? You can drink alcohol in a public place, you can drink it in a private place, but you can't do it on the street because that's public intoxication and that's worth a fine. You can cross the street all you want, but as soon as you bring out your phone and it poses a risk, the government has every responsibility under the Constitution to implement a fine on this because their obligation and the reason why we should do this is to protect the American people. And then the final argument you said is that people fear the police. I would say this isn't fearing the police at all. This is in fact making a safer community. Because as a driver, as a young driver, the most thing that you want on the street is for there to be less obstacles. If people are not looking down on the phone, you have a better environment.
Let me remind everybody of what the proposal before us is. Texting while walking in public should be fined. It is not talking about using your phone, not talking about playing video games. It's not talking specifically about crossing the street. It's not talking about any particular thing. It's saying in public, anywhere in the public sphere, if you have your phone out and you are specifically texting, and you are walking at the same time, you should get a fine. That is what we are asked to uphold today. I'm saying, no, that's not a very good idea. I have listed why it doesn't work, and we don't really have any rebuttal from the positive to say it was. He just says, well, we should take some action. Well, yeah, I would like to see the bottom of the ocean, to do all kinds of interesting things, maybe, but it doesn't mean we should take action on every harm out there. People install lightning rods on every corner. We don't need to make laws to make every part of life risk-free and wonderful. We have a public and a private sphere, and the private sphere needs to take care of some certain things. We have our own responsibility. So we don't want to create a police state. Why? It's a waste of our resources. It criminalizes a common action, which is texting on your phone, walking around. It leads to police violence. It leads to racism. It victimizes the poor with unnecessary fines. All of these things are not good. And if you add to it, even if you said, well, you know, Sig, I mean, I want to take some action here. I just want to be an action kind of a guy. And, well, then banning texting while walking or fining texting while walking in public is not the way to do it. That's what the resolution calls for. I say that's a bad idea. There are better ideas. The best idea, however, is not to fine people for using their phone in public. It is to educate people to be smarter and to be more cautious, let them know the dangers, and then they can make decisions for themselves. And if they get hurt, well, that's their punishment for getting hurt. I am much more likely to fear a car than I am a cop randomly on the street is going to come up and give me a $25 fine for using my phone. If anything, all I'll do is, like drivers all around the country when it comes to speeding, if I see a cop, I'll put away my phone, and the rest of the time I'll have it out. So it's just not going to work. It's been shown that it doesn't work. Feasibility is important when you're implementing a law. The reason why? Because there are all kinds of problems, disadvantages, and trouble that come with creating laws. We have to weigh the harms that the law is designed to prevent with the effectiveness that we think it will have in preventing it against the harms and cost caused to enforce that law. Simple public policy. We should apply it in the debate here today.
So let's first talk about the topicality of the resolution. He's going to try to paint this picture that I have to tell you anytime while walking in public should be fined. That would be great if something like drinking and driving is always a punishable offense. But as I started my case, I told you that if you drink a beer and go drive a car, there's no problem with that. You don't have to say that drinking while driving is always punishable. In this debate, I'm specifically saying you can text and walk on the sidewalk. That's fine. The only time I would institute a fine is when you're crossing the street. And as the pro side, I have the ability to define the specific scenario because I would be the one providing the plan, I guess, for the fine. So I would say it's only when you're crossing the street, not in general public. Then he reads these 5 points about 5 harms. I would say that if you really analyze the arguments, you see that there's no real link to texting and walking. Doesn't even get close to jaywalking, right? The idea of police violence is originated from the idea of Terry stops. Terry stops are really problematic because those are drivers getting stopped at random police searches. I would say that unless he gives you specific evidence on jaywalking, he gives you one in Sacramento. I would say that overall on a whole, you saw in New York City and Chicago, the number of jaywalking incidents go down as a result of this fine being instituted. And that goes to the idea of that, well, if I'm walking on the street, I'm just going to put my phone away. I would say that instituting a fine proves as a deterrent. And so if anyone's discouraged to use their phone because they're afraid of being fined and possibly being involved in a police confrontation, then that's a good thing. Because I don't have to stop texting while walking in public all the time, but if I'm able to reduce it any amount, then I'm helping protect Americans, and thus I'm upholding to one of the U.S.'s obligations. And then you go to this idea about education. You're saying, well, you know what, let's just educate people on not to text while walk instead of instituting a fine. I would say that education doesn't work, and the best example is on drugs. We have plenty of drug education in high schools and colleges, in elementary schools, yet the number of drug usage on a whole in America is increasing. I would say the only effect that helps reduce this is legislation and stricter laws. Because when you don't have any legal punishment, there's no real reason to stop people. Education isn't a movement that works unless you have evidence specifically proving why. So now on the reasons why you can vote in the affirmative side is because I tell you that despite him trying to paint this picture that there's no feasibility, 2 states in the last 3 weeks have already enacted legislation to stop texting while walking while crossing a street. It happened in Honolulu, and then it happened in Stamford, Connecticut, and there's several other states that want to follow suit. Why? Because they know while crossing the street is dangerous, and they want to protect the American people. But this also leaves one really important statistic that was never refuted, and that's the fact that while you're talking on the phone, there's a 12% risk for collision. When you're texting, there's 25%. That specifically makes it the most dangerous thing to do while crossing the street, and why I specifically advocate for a fine.
I'll start with the last thing first, just so I don't forget it this time. So saying that there's this chance that when you're texting that you might be hurt than when you're using the phone. But as we pointed out, a lot more people talk on the phone than text on the phone. A lot of kids like to text on the phone. Maybe that'll change in the future, but right now that's the case. I showed hard evidence that the statistics from studying the number of actual accidents that happen, not the danger of any particular activity, but the real world situation. And I believe it was, 6%, 8%? It was pretty low, 9%. 9% of accidents come from texting, 69% of them come from talking on the phone. So if you really want to solve the problem, if you want less people to be hurt, which seems like a good policy to me, then you should include all forms of distraction while walking, reading a newspaper, trying to do your makeup, whatever it happens to be. There's a lot of reasons that these things happen. Talking on the phone is number one at the top. If this was Family Feud, it would be ding, 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 and texting would be down there somewhere 5 or 6 worth 5 points. So you really want to address the real problem if you're trying to make government policy. Now, he wants to take the resolution and he wants to say, well, it's just when you're walking across the street and it's just when you're texting. And look, I read the resolution. Texting while walking in public should be fine. That's pretty straightforward. You picked this resolution in order to be pro. And I think I want to hold you responsible for text of the resolution, not changing it to meet what you think is a viable case. We all have to make our choices when we're setting up these debates. The resolution text is the ground that you have to fight on. So I'm holding you to it. The audience can make up their own decision on that regard. Now, a fine as a deterrent, as we showed, people are a little bit worried about fines, but not nearly as much as they are about dying. Education hopefully works a little bit. This country is founded on the public education system. So in theory, going to school and learning things is helpful. Does it guarantee that people act in a certain way? No, but it can help. And I'm sure drug education has helped 1 or 2 children at least over the years. I know when I was in school, I learned about drugs through drug education. I've never taken any drugs. Does it work? Does it not work? We'll, again, let the audience decide. I think it's quite plausible that these things can be effective. However, we have no evidence that these texting laws are effective. Yet we have lots of evidence that they can cause all kinds of harms. Let me talk a little bit and extend the violent encounters. He talked about Terry stops. This is from Mrs. Issues in 2016. If we want to be serious about interactions with the public, or the police interactions with the public can lead to violent escalations, and must first scale back the number of offenses that can lead to serious fines and imprisonment for members of the public, while shifting the concentration of police efforts to violent crime and property crime. When you make a whole bunch of laws about little niggling things, people can get into all kinds of trouble with fines and fees in courts. We don't want that. We want life to be good.
Last speech, I'll give all the voters why you can vote pro. First, on the resolution. Again, I didn't pick this. I chose pro because I thought there's specific harms in it. But even as I said in my first case, which went unrefuted, drinking and driving, that's not always fine. It's not always punished. Gambling, not always punished. If you're doing it for charity, it's not. With this, it's a broad topic. I would say that I advocate for the fine in a specific situation, which is very feasible because the government has fines on specific sections of things, not on an overall topic. Then let's go to the reasons why you can vote pro. First is the idea that he says 9% of accidents come from texting, 68% come from talking. It would be better to have laws on talking. I would say that even if you believe that, you can still vote pro, because if you believe that there's a harm from texting while walking, then there's already affirmative ground. Even if you think that talking is also a problem, you can affirm anyway, and we can address talking later. But the most important is that if you believe there's a harm from texting, that's affirmative ground. The next is this announcement effect. I turned that argument and then it was dropped off the flow because essentially he said, well, there was laws against texting while driving, and then the amount of it stopped people was for a couple months, and then it really went back up to normal. I think that's really problematic because essentially you're making the underlying argument that any form of legislation that doesn't actually promote a change shouldn't be enacted. I would say that if it's a deterrent to anyone crossing a street while texting, even if it brings the number of people down by 5%, then it's doing its job. The government should not just give up on legislation just because there's a chance that 6 months down the road it won't have any effect, because the government's job is to stop things that are wrong, which goes on to the idea of feasibility. My job in this debate is not to prove feasibility, because there's no way for me to tell you how these laws are going to work. But what I did tell you is that it happened in Honolulu and it happened in Stanford just 3 weeks ago. The reason why is because these government bodies believe that they would make a change in their community, and is the only reason they spent hours forming legislation to make a fine for these specific situations. If there's a reason why legislators are doing it, and until you can tell me why that's a bad idea, then I don't really see why we can't go with the feasibility of legislation. Then we go down to the specific numbers. The National Council told you that in the last 11 years, there's been 11,101 injuries. It doubled in the last 5 because of the increased use of smartphones, specifically an increased amount of texting. And the biggest problem is that when you're texting, you are the most distracted, and you are 25% chance of having a collision. I would say that in those 30 seconds it takes to cross the street, there's no chance that police violence will be escalated, which at the end of the debate is the only real argument I think you have left, is that maybe police violence will increase or racism will increase. I say that as a voter, if you think that you can help the safety of Americans rather than looking at the potential harms of violence, you ought to vote pro, because you follow what the government's been doing.
The pro case would have us believe that on the off chance that we might be able to stop a few people's pedestrian accidents. We don't know if it will. We presume, yeah, maybe a few people will. In order for that possibility, very, very slim and likely zero, we should allow the police to stop and fine any American walking anywhere in the public streets who has their phone, or he would say in a crosswalk, but that's not the resolution. The resolution is walking in public while texting. Who knows if they're texting? The police, oh, I thought he was texting. Sir, I was playing Pokemon. No, I thought you were texting. Oh, got a bulge I see in your pocket there. Let me see if you have some marijuana on you. Oh, let me see your driver's license. I need to. You're giving the police incredible powers beyond anything that they have currently. And we have seen time and time again in our society, one of the strongest divisions we have in our social sphere right now has to do with police racism, unnecessary search and seizure, violence as the result of police encounters with people from everyday things. A police officer in my hometown was called to a lady's apartment because she had heard that there was a disturbance. Pregnant lady answers the door and she gets shot 13 times. Do we want the police expanding their powers so significantly that they can talk to anybody, anytime on the street, harass them, and issue them tickets? I don't think so. These harms are very real. We've seen them every day. We're struggling to try and get a handle on the situation, and the affirmative team wants to expand it because we just might be able to protect some people who are foolish enough to be staring at their phone while they're crossing the street. I find this to be ridiculous contention. I think it's un-American. I think it is dangerous. And I do not think it will significantly impact public safety. It just goes against human nature to think that, everywhere I go, I better not pull out my phone because a cop might be just around the corner. He's going to jump out. He's going to issue me a $25 ticket. That's much more important than the business deal that I've got going on, than that really cute girl I want to message from the coffee shop. This is not going to happen. It's not going to work. I know that, yes, states, governments have decided that they want to be our nanny and jump in and try to fix things, but they've got it's a terribly misguided idea because it's going to lead to a lot of problems, and it is likely not going to affect the solution. It just makes us feel like we're doing something useful. And with that, I urge you to vote con in this case.